Michael, what's going on, bud? So just wanted to review over this Excel spreadsheet that I attached to your email before we get into the motion capture analysis. So right in here, right, all of these columns, these are all hyperlinks. So feel free to click on those, get a little bit further detail, but for the sake of time, I'm just gonna touch on the yellows and the reds as we go throughout this checklist. But again, feel free to click on those links if you wanna check out anything else. And then for player comp, I put you with Aaron Hicks. We looked at some of his videos. Just because you said that you're mostly an outfielder, right? Which I think is what you're getting recruited as, but obviously you're going through a full delivery here as well. So I just kind of went ahead and touched on a few things with that, but let's just go ahead and get into it, right? So refer to your videos here. Now the first thing I want to point out before we get into any of this, right, is how you're throwing into your plyos, right? So hopefully you can see that there. Okay, so if you're throwing right here, okay, and I'll get into this more with the arm spiral, how everything's coming out. You're throwing this direction, okay, and your feet are kind of lined up over here, right? What I would like for you to do to help your arm action be a lot more efficient, we'll get into that later, set yourself up more like towards this green door to where you don't have to basically dodge this light right there. Because it looks like you're compensating, and if your arm was just to spiral out like it should, you probably would have thrown it into this light or maybe into this garage. But we go back into here, you can see how everything is kind of going off this way, and then you pull everything back around. So I'm not sure if that's due to you just trying to hit the wall a certain way, but scoot this way, right? To where you, instead of setting yourself up here, you set yourself up right there, and that'll definitely help out, just cleaning up your arm action so that way you don't have to worry about knocking out the light or anything like that, okay? Now, when we go into the actual checklist portion here, right, I'm gonna scoot this back towards the beginning, right? So your setup and your first move. Setup's green, I don't have any issues with your setup, right? But as you're lifting your leg here, you can see how you're kind of like leaning back like this. You don't necessarily want to do that, right? If you're lifting, you want to drift down, right? So you can see how as you keep going down, your head's still stuck versus it going with your torso. Okay, you want to go like this, right? Now, is it due to you being tight in your adductors or any other portion of your lower half? It's possible, right? But again, we're just kind of going over for the sake of movement, right? And we can get into this a little bit more. Zoom this in a little bit. All right. Now, for the next one, right? So posture is good. Leg lift, initial weight shift is a possible issue. Being stuck back here like this. We want to continue going down the mountain. Now we get into just the back leg side of things, right? So do you engage the rear glute? Basically meaning, do you engage your glute medius right here on this side, right? Which you do a good job of. However, once we get further down the line here, you do kind of push and overextend this leg. So you see how it's already flexed in this position. Now, as you continue to go through, you can see how everything is straightening out before this front foot even hits the ground, right? So now it's super straight there, right? Everything's very extended, which we don't necessarily want, right? We want it to be a lot more flexed and actually rotate down versus jumping or extending. Okay, so that's why I gave you red on that one. And then vertical shin angle, it's when we scoot this back a little bit, right? You do hold this, but from this position, like I was talking about, you want it to rotate down, very similar to hitting, right? You don't hit like this, right? Where you're extending out that front leg, or at least I hope you don't, right? You're loading this back hip, and everything's going and rotating this way. So it's very similar to hitting. You're just picking up your front leg and you're having a lot more longer of a stride, right? Now, do you stay into your heel or do you rise onto your toes early? So once you pay attention to your back foot here, as you're extending, you're kind of going onto the ball of your feet there. Can't find my shoes anywhere, just use mine. So when you extend, right, and you're coming forward, you see how you're kind of coming up onto the edge of your toes like this, and then you're pivoting off of like this ball of your foot or your big toe. What really should be happening is you pivoting through like where these Adidas symbols are, right here in this middle part of your foot. to go like this, right? And that's gonna help you be a lot more efficient through rotation. Now, why you don't do that could be a multiple set of reasons, right? It could be you might have twisted your ankle or something back in the day and you don't have that mobility through your foot, or you just have never done it before and you don't know how to move that way, right? So again, we need some further assessment to be able to tell how we could attack that. If you have the range of motion already, then it's more of just learning how to do it, which is the easy part, right? But if you had previous injury history or anything like that, those would definitely be a bigger hurdle that we'd have to jump over in order to accomplish that. Now, directionality of drive. I'm actually going to give that a yellow and change my mind after watching this again. So if we come right here, right, come back, as you're loading, everything should be going like towards this green door here. Versus what we are starting to look at, right, as you're starting to come forward and you're going onto your ball of your foot, everything seems to be going this way. Okay, so your direction is kind of off like this versus being straight. I'm going to show you a video of good old Hicks here, right? So obviously this throw is 105, it's probably the biggest one that everybody knows about from Aaron Hicks. He's coming through here. You can see how his back leg really rotates down, right? Everything comes through this way, boom, right? And then everything else is just spinning around like that. Okay, and all of his direction is going towards where he's throwing the ball. Everything's going this way. There's nothing coming off over here or over to that side. It's all, because he's got to be super efficient to be able to get that ball out of his hand and get everything to a home plate, right? So just keep that in mind. And I'll send those Aaron Hicks videos over to you so you can use those as a frame of reference. Now, with that being said, right, so as he's coming through here, he's still driving and rotating down. If we go to your videos, right, you can see the difference. How you're going from here, extending, and that kneecap is still pointed towards this camera view. In this case, it's pointing over here, right? Same thing over here, it's still pointing over on this side, right? And then after you've already rotated everything, then it starts to come down. So that's super late, and it's why your back knee is actually probably more of a red, if anything, and why you're coming out of your drive early. Now, we can talk about lateral versus vertical grounding action force. You're definitely more on the vertical side, so this is vertical, this is lateral, right? And this is your shin angle right here. You want to have a little bit in between, where that shin is actually going into hip internal rotation before you start to rise to your toes, right? So again, right here, I want you to see how you're not pivoting as you're getting to this lane, so that foot should still be in contact with the ground at that point in time, right? So your lateral ground reaction force is actually more vertical. Okay, now when we get to does your back foot maintain contact at ball release? It does, right? This one, it's actually kind of up off the ground, but you just want it to remain at least in somewhat a bit of a contact, which is telling us that this back hip is doing its job and rotating all the way down. So this one and this one it does. This one you're a little bit closed off, and we'll go ahead and transition to that for the next portion of the checklist, which is your pelvis, right? So when you land right there, your pelvis is faced this way, or in this case, pointed straight towards the camera. Same thing over here, it's pointed this way, right? What you want to have happen is when you land, that pelvis should already be faced forward, and then everything else is still in maximal tension, right? Everything's still being pulled back like this. So, and we can take a look at Hicks here, right? So we go back. When he lands, look at where his belt buckle is, right? That belt buckle is faced towards where he's throwing it, versus yours is completely that way, right? So you can see the difference there. Okay, so that's why that is very closed and red for me. But, you know, once you start to rotate, everything starts to rotate down, which is good, right? So you have your timing and everything is a little bit off as far as your pelvis from it being closed, just not being in the right positions at the right point in time. And then does your pelvis move independently of your torso? So your pelvis goes and your shoulders are actually going at the exact same time. Okay, I'm gonna change that one there too. So you've heard of this concept, maybe even a little bit in hitting as well, right? Hip shoulder separation, or we like to use the term segmentation, right? So when you get your pelvis opened up this way like this, all of this is still going to be pulled back, and then they're going to come and rotate shortly right after that. So first thing is pelvis, and then everything else rotates, right? Versus them coming together, right? As these two are rotating, they're kind of coming together as one solid chunk, right? So if you look at yours, you can see how once it starts to rotate, everything else is rotating with it. So that's what we call lack of segmentation. Segmentation, just to get a little bit more clear on this, so your pelvis is here, everything else is pulled back, right? So pelvis, and then your lumbar spine's a little bit further back. So imagine like a spiral staircase, right? So this is the bottom step, and the next one's here, here, right? And it's spiraling up. So same thing here. This one's slightly turned this way, up through the spine, right? Everything else is more back like this, and then it unwinds, right? And the faster you can close this gap from here to here, the more efficient you are gonna be with your torso. So that's why that's a yellow, because of, you know, everything going together. Delete these lines so you can see it a little bit better. But you can see how pelvis and torso are going at the same time. Pelvis is already here. You can see how his jersey is still back like this, right? And then he starts to bring everything through, right? 105 miles an hour from the outfield. It's pretty impressive. Okay, now we go to the torso, right? Do you have excessive counter rotation? Meaning, like, do you overly rotate like this? And I don't think you really do. I think it's mostly just your arm action that's getting most of that rotation, so that's a green from me. You don't have early torso rotation, right? So everything's closed off. We want that pelvis to be open, but not the shoulders, right? So if your shoulders are open, that would be early torso rotation. But that's a green for me. And again, going back to the torso, not segmenting from the pelvis. Excuse me. So you want that torso to be here, right? That segmentation, everything working as one individual piece versus one solid chunk. Okay, and then the next one, Bowflex bow. We want to get into this a little bit. So as you're coming down the mount through here, obviously you're loading into your back hip, but you're actually kind of more so just bending back versus having a little bit of forward flexion like this, right? So you want to have some forward flexion as you're coming through, and then when you land, pelvis is open, you have thoracic extension, or the flex, and then you bow or have more thoracic flexion, right, as you come in through that. So with that being said, when we look at yours, you could get a lot better of the first initial bow. The flex is really good, and then the last bow seems to be doing pretty well. You kind of bounce back a little bit. And don't worry about catching your ball on the way back. What you could do is put like a pole or something right here to catch the ball from rolling further back, but you don't want to disrupt your deceleration pattern by trying to catch the ball or stop it. So just another little hack there for you. Now, still talking about the torso, right? Where does your arm start in regards to your torso? Okay, most people are like, oh, well, it starts like right here. Actually, right, if you remember back in maybe some anatomy classes you may have had, or biology classes, or maybe just looking, researching some stuff yourself, the pec actually starts here at the sternum and then comes through and attaches up here. The pec actually attaches right here on your humerus, okay? So when all these kind of meet together, it's right there. And then on the flip side of that, you have your scap, right? And all this, your collarbone too, all this connects right here. So actually it's starting more in your midline and then comes to that point. So with that being said, if these are restricted, you're lacking range of motion, you want to look here first before we look at just the arm itself. Okay, so in return of talking about scapular dig, there's a lot of guys who are thinking more like pulling it back actively and even hitting, right? A lot of guys think they need to load their hands back when in all reality, right? And we get this term scapular dig from the javelin community, right? So guys have to be super efficient with their throws. They're coming around this way. As their torso is rotated, like this, the scap posteriorly tilts, wraps around that rib cage there, right? So it comes like this. Everything, just slingshots forward like that. So when you have that tilt or that scapular dig, back in here like this, that's also gonna stretch, right? So now we're talking about the reflexive pec fire. It's gonna stretch the pec back, right? So think about a rubber band. If you stretched it back only 5 inches, it would only go so far, right? So that would be like this, maybe right in there. But if you pulled it back even further, let's say 10 inches, so if we get back in here, that's gonna shoot the rubber band, and the rubber band's gonna go a lot further. So the same thing applies to the elasticity of our muscles, right? So if we're getting back here, we get more dig, more reflexive pec fire from being back here, and slingshotting the arm forward, right? You can actually see this happening, right? When we look at Hicks here, you can see how he's way further back, bounce back a few frames, right? Here you can see his arm back here, and this is where his torso is, right? So he's getting crazy amounts of shoulder abduction, and then everything just slingshots forward, right? So just keep that in mind when we're looking at your video. You're not getting as far back as I think you could, right? You're probably even with your head versus Hicks was probably like back in here, right? Not necessarily meaning that you need to go to external rotation too soon, right? So if you look at some of these and you're landing, you're going into external rotation before you even start to rotate. So that could be, I'll get into that a little bit once we get to the arm action side of things. But again, if this improves, then this pec will also not be a red either. Okay. Now, if you look at your arm slot, does it match your torso rotation? Your forearm is actually higher. I don't know why I put it on that one. We're gonna paste that right there. Okay. So let's look at your video. So from right here, you're starting to rotate. Again, we're still just looking at this video on the far left-hand side. Looking at this, right? We would expect your arm to come out and spiral out along that line and probably actually throw the ball right at where that light is, right? But if you can see how you're tilted a little bit more, right? And then your forearm is up. So instead of it being even, your forearm is up like this, right? And that's gonna cause you to push the ball a little bit, right? So in these next couple frames, you see how the elbow's leading the way, and then it pushes everything through. You're just kind of catapulting it versus being a lot more elastic and letting the arm work more reflexively, right? Like I was talking about beforehand. So that's why that's a yellow for me. Now, do you rotate perpendicular to your spine? That you actually do a good job with, right? So spine being here, do you rotate this way versus like slamming down like this, right? And everything's rotating that way, which is good for me. Now, if you have excessive tilt or rotation, like you're excessively leaning that way, you don't, so that's a green, right? Now, do you have uphill shoulder tilt? So at weight-bearing foot plant, we're gonna look at that right here. Not quite landing just yet on this one, right? You can see how your shoulders are tilted like you're about to launch, and especially this one, this red ball, you're really tilted up, right? It looks like you're about to launch this ball over the house, right? You're like this, right? So you have to go from here to then all the way down like this. Let's look at Hicks. He's obviously throwing a lot further too, right? But let's look and see where he's at. At landing, he's here, right? He's relatively even, okay? And he's still throwing the ball probably further than maybe 150 feet, right? But you're like this. So you're like angled as if you're about to long toss 350 feet or so, right? Which is going to affect how your arm action will actually work. And we'll get into that in the next section here. Okay, so your arm action, does it capture momentum? Okay, and to me it looks like you're kind of muscling things up, like you're trying to just pull it all up and muscle with your trap, right? Everything up in here, versus just letting it be loose, free and easy, and then letting that momentum, right, of this downswing when you break your hands help you get to this position versus right here. You can see how you're kind of just lifting it up with your trap versus using momentum to get you here, and then all you have left to do is just rotate. Okay, so that's why that's a red for me. Now, do you have overly pronated or supinated? When you break your hands, you're coming out relatively pronated for me, right? So you're coming out like this, okay? So just think more keeping the ball faced towards where you're throwing the ball, and then as you're coming through this way, you might be cutting it just a little bit, right? So your forearm is a little bit supinated, right? So when you release the ball, at ball release, skipping ahead here, you have a supinated wrist at release like this versus being here, right? So if you're going like this, one, it's due to you having to compensate because of where you're trying to throw the ball into, right? So instead of being over here like I talked about at the beginning, you're having to cut it, come around this way, and that's probably why on some of your further throws you're cutting it as well. So you want to make sure you get away from that movement pattern. All right. Now your elbows are in line with your shoulders. Even though you're tilted, your elbow is in line. So if we corrected your tilt, your elbow would be in line with your shoulders. So that's a green. Now you have very late flip up at weight bearing foot plant. So what I mean by that is when you hit the ground, that forearm is here. This would be on time, and this would be early. Okay. So if you look at this, here's you. Probably at weight bearing foot plant there. Actually, these are early. Yeah, you're going in an external rotation, especially that red ball, before you even rotate. This one's probably more on time, but even then that foot hasn't quite hit yet until there. So yeah, you're actually early, not late. All right, and then elbow flexion, okay? If we looked at this, deleted this right here, this is 90 degrees, and you're actually a little bit further inside 90, so what's that causing us to do when you're further inside? It's gonna cause us to push and then catapult with your arm versus being here, spiraling out like I was talking about when you're using your pec, okay? So that's why that one was red for me as well. Obviously, we already talked about the scap retraction, abduction, right? So you're limited in here, which is obviously you can't get full scap retraction in your throwing arm if you can't, get into that position in the first place due to your torso. So that's a yellow. And then as it's coming through, right, you can see how your arm's just kind of dragging behind versus, right? And again, you want these to be different. You want your torso and your arm to have some segmentation and work independently, right? But you can see how everything's here, and it's just dragging behind a little bit, so that's why it's a yellow. But you don't have limited layback or external rotation, right? Looks like you're getting plenty of external rotation right there. So that's a green for me. But like I said, your elbow pushes forward. Due to this being too far in, the elbow's gonna lead and like push like this versus the pec, everything else leading, and then everything else comes right behind that, right? So I'll show you that right here, right? So, and let's even track. I want you to see how much space your elbow is having to go from this position to now it's here, right? Now it's up here, and again, you're a little bit supinated, right? So you're going from like this, like that, versus being here, being very direct and just rotating through that. And you can see that through Hicks' video, right? So he's going here, right? He has a little bit of lean, but he's still like this, right? Everything's very direct. It's not going that, okay? So big differences there on the throwing arm. Now I already kind of touched on the elbow being straight. Your elbow's bent and your wrist is supinated, right? So that's why that's a yellow. And then, does your arm work independently of your torso? It kind of does, but I think it's mostly due to your arm kind of just dragging behind versus, being a little bit more in time there, right? So it's just dragging like this versus working independently this way, okay? So that's why I gave you yellow for that one. Now glove arm side, not terrible. So just like we need retraction from the throwing arm like this, you also need retraction from the glove side, okay? Obviously the throwing arm happens first, then this happens. You can definitely see it in Hicks as well, right? His video comes here. You can see how he's not pulling it, it's just here, and then everything rotates that way, okay? So you can see how that's working, right? If he was pulling it, it would be way over here like this, but it goes here, Okay, so that's the only thing that I give you a red on. Like, it doesn't supinate, it's working together, so all of that's good, right? It rotates when I'm playing shoulder rotation. You're not like blocking yourself off. You're just lacking that retraction at landing, right? So at landing, that's when we're starting to retract. Okay. Now, lead leg side of things. Again, I want you to, let's look at the back leg in relation to this and your hips. Okay. So your hips are still faced this way and your foot's already open, right? Which is okay, but that's telling me that these aren't working together, right? So we want the back hip or the back leg to open up the front one, right? Versus it kind of swinging open and doing its own thing there. Right, so you can see how this one, your foot's already open, right? Still landing closed. So again, that's why I gave you yellow on it swinging open and just being a little bit independent. But your foot contact though, like you're landing on your whole foot, which is green for me, I like that. And then your leg does paw back. However, let's go back to when you're at weight bearing foot plant right here. Okay, we'll just look at this one. This one hasn't quite hit yet. And I'll zoom in on this one. All right, so if we draw a line where your shin is, if it shifts to the left or right, or forward towards home plate, or where you're throwing the ball, right, that's where you're going to have a little bit of velocity leak in that front leg. So you can see how much that front leg's already leaked forward, right? So every inch that it leaks forward is about 1 to 2 miles an hour. From one of our coaches did a study on that. So you can see how everything's just leaking, and then it pulls back. So that's why I gave you a yellow on the frontal plane, so frontal plane being this way, but also on the transverse plane too. And so if you look at this, this is where you're landing. Here's your shin right here on this side. After you release it, it's kind of shifted a little bit off to that side. So again, there are possible issues. I would actually change that to a definite red flag for the frontal plane one, but the other one is kind of just a caution. Okay. Now, the deceleration side of things, after you let go of the ball, right? So if you come right here, you actually decelerate fairly well. Your forearm pronates, shoulder does internally rotate, right? That's just bending your arm. So you do a really good job of that. Definitely see it right in here. Now you want the scap to come through and protract that way, right? Which it does a really good job of. The only thing that I'm really getting here is that you could probably continue to rotate your shoulders just a little bit longer, right? Versus just going here and then bouncing back. Just let them rotate, and then you can bounce back by using your trunk, but not this, okay? So that's where we get into trouble, is when you start to bounce back with just your arm. Okay, so kind of similar to this one right here, where everything's kind of just with your arm versus going here. Right, Stroman does a really good job of it. When you watch him throw, he'll bounce back with his trunk, not with just his arm like that. That's where guys get into trouble. But you're green on that. But again, you probably could just rotate a little bit more with your torso after you let go of the ball for deceleration purposes. Now, for your tempo, again, this isn't necessarily as important for outfielders, but if you're pitching, right, you want to count from when you're at peak leg lift to ball release. But these are all slow-mo videos, so I'll need a regular speed video to be able to tell exactly when that is. But just to let you know, this is 19 to 21, this is 22 to 24, 25 plus is red for tempo-wise. All right, so if you get a regular speed video, you can check yourself, see if you're moving efficiently enough or if you're getting a little bit too slow. Rhythm-wise, everything's good. Rhythm, like everything's flowing together. Outside of like this leg pushing and everything just not being in the right places, like it's still, for what your movement is, there's no like huge jerking movements or anything like that. So you're green for me on there. And then one of these questions that I'll ask you at the very end here is your intent. Okay, when do you feel like you're really gearing back and throwing the baseball as hard as you can? Are you starting that here, back here? You're waiting till ball release, right? I'm not trying to put any words into your mouth. I want to hear it from you on when you feel like you're implying your intent. Okay, and then the very last one here, your cervical position dissociation, right? Like, can you look over your glove side, which it looks like you have no issues with that, right? Some guys who are very restricted in this will have that early torso rotation just because they can't look over their glove side. So, but you're green for me on that. But yeah, Michael, that's it for the checklist for me, bud. So I'm sure you'll have some questions. So go ahead and make a list of all those, and we'll go over that on our call, and we'll talk to you then.